There is a moment, and almost every person alive has experienced it, where you are standing in a conversation or sitting in a meeting or reading a message on your phone, and something inside you goes very quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes with peace, the kind of quiet that comes before a storm, because you are looking at something or someone, and you are realizing with absolute clarity that no amount of words, no amount of logic, no amount of patience is going to change what is happening in front of you. And in that moment, something in you wants to explode. Something in you wants to grab that person by the shoulders and shake them until sense falls out. You want to argue, you want to correct, you want to win. And here is what nobody tells you. That urge, that burning, desperate need to make a foolish person understand you is not a sign of your intelligence. It is the first trap. And most people fall into it every single day of their lives, losing energy, losing peace, losing years, all because they never learned the one skill that separates people who suffer through life from people who move through it with power. Stay with me, because in the next 60 seconds, I am going to show you something that will make you question every conflict you have ever had, and whether you were actually the wise one in the room. There is a story that has been passed down through generations of monks, warriors, and philosophers, people who understood something about human nature that the modern world has almost completely forgotten. A student once approached his teacher in frustration. He had been arguing with a man in the village for hours. The man was wrong, provably, demonstrably, completely wrong. And yet, no matter what the student said, the man refused to listen. The student asked his teacher, "How do I make him understand?" And the teacher looked at him for a long moment and said, "Why are you trying to pour water into a cup that is already full?" That question changed the student's life. And if you sit with it long enough, it might change yours too. Because here is the truth that most motivational content will never tell you. The problem is not stupid people. Stupid people have existed since the beginning of human civilization. They existed when the great philosophers walked the earth. They existed in the courts of emperors and in the halls of universities and in every village and city and family across all of recorded history. The problem is not that foolish people exist. The problem is that wise people have never been properly taught how to handle them. And because of that gap in education, that silence in our upbringing, most people who consider themselves intelligent, thoughtful, and aware are being absolutely destroyed by people who never think twice. Think about the last time someone said something to you that was wrong. Not just a little wrong, deeply, frustratingly, almost offensively wrong. Maybe it was a colleague who took credit for your work and genuinely seemed to believe their own version of events. Maybe it was a family member who gave you advice that was so outdated and misguided it almost felt like a joke. Maybe it was a stranger online who responded to something you said with such a breathtaking display of ignorance that you found yourself staring at the screen, wondering how this person manages to get through a single day. And what did you do? If you are honest with yourself, really honest, you probably engaged. You probably tried to explain. You probably spent energy. You probably walked away feeling worse than when the interaction began. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. And it is a pattern that only ends when you understand something fundamental about the nature of foolishness and the nature of wisdom and the very specific way these two forces interact when they collide in the real world. Let us start at the beginning. Let us start with what foolishness actually is, because most people define it wrong. Most people think foolishness is a lack of information. They think that if they could just explain things clearly enough, if they could just find the right words or the right argument or the right moment, the foolish person would suddenly see the light. This assumption is the root of almost all the unnecessary suffering that intelligent people experience in their relationships, their workplaces, and their inner lives. Foolishness is not a lack of information. Foolishness is a relationship with reality. It is the condition of someone who has decided, consciously or not, that their version of the world is complete, that they already know enough, that incoming information only matters if it confirms what they already believe. You cannot fix this with an argument. You cannot fix this with evidence. Because the very mechanism they would need to receive your correction is the same mechanism that has been switched off. This is why arguing with certain people feels like trying to fight smoke. The moment you think you have grabbed something, it shifts. The moment you make a point, they change the subject. The moment you present evidence, they question your motives. It is not a debate strategy. It is the natural behavior of a mind that is defending itself from the discomfort of being wrong. And that defense mechanism is extraordinarily powerful. In many cases, it has been built up over decades of reinforcement. You are not going to dismantle it in a conversation. You are not going to dismantle it in 100 conversations. So what do wise people actually do? What does the person look like who has genuinely mastered this? Not just intellectually, but in the way they walk through the world, in the way they respond when tested, in the way they feel at the end of a difficult day. The first thing you notice about them is that they have made peace with something that most people spend their whole lives fighting against. They have made peace with the fact that they cannot control other people's minds. This sounds simple. It is not. It is one of the hardest pieces of ground a human being can stand on, because everything in our social conditioning pushes us in the opposite direction. We are taught from childhood that if we just communicate well enough, if we are just patient enough, if we try hard enough, we can reach anyone. And sometimes that is true, but only sometimes. And the wise person has learned to tell the difference, and that difference changes everything. There is a concept that ancient traditions have pointed to across cultures and across centuries. The idea that there are things within your circle of influence and things outside of it. And the degree to which you spend your energy on things outside your circle of influence is the degree to which your life will feel out of control, exhausting, and meaningless. Foolish people, specifically people who are committed to their foolishness, are outside your circle of influence, not because they are beyond help as human beings, but because help, real growth, real change can only happen when a person opens themselves to it. And that opening is something only they can do. You cannot do it for them. You cannot force it open. The moment you try, you have already lost. Now here is where it gets interesting, because recognizing this truth is only the first step. The second step is understanding what wise people do with the energy they save by not fighting those unwinnable battles. Because this is the part that most people miss. They think wisdom in the face of foolishness means simply doing nothing. Staying silent, being passive, walking away with a kind of defeated resignation. That is not wisdom. That is just exhaustion wearing a philosophical hat. True wisdom is active. True wisdom is strategic. When a wise person disengages from a foolish argument, they are not retreating, they are redirecting. They are taking the energy that would have been consumed in a futile conflict and pouring it into something that actually has the power to grow, to build, to move forward. Think about water. Water does not argue with a rock. Water does not push against a rock and demand that it move. Water flows around the rock, and over time, quietly, consistently, without drama, water reshapes the entire landscape. The rock is still there. The rock has not changed, but the world around it has been completely transformed by the patient, purposeful movement of something that understood its own nature and trusted it. That is what wise people look like in the face of foolishness. Not defeated, not passive. Patient, purposeful, and deeply committed to a direction that does not require the foolish person to change in order to succeed. Let us talk about something that very few people are willing to talk about honestly, the ego, your ego specifically, because here is something uncomfortable that needs to be said out loud. Most of the reason we engage with foolish people, most of the reason we cannot simply let it go and walk away, has very little to do with truth or justice or making the world a better place. It has to do with our need to be seen as right, our need to be validated, our need to have the record reflect that we were the intelligent one in the room. And that need, as understandable as it is, as deeply human as it is the leash that foolish people, often without even knowing it, use to drag us down to their level. There is an old saying that when you wrestle with a pig, you both get dirty, but the pig enjoys it. Most people have heard this. Far fewer people have truly absorbed it, because absorbing it means confronting something difficult about yourself. The recognition that every time you have been pulled into a pointless argument, every time you have felt your blood pressure rise in response to someone's ignorance, every time you have lost sleep composing imaginary rebuttals to something someone said, you were not the victim of their foolishness. You were a participant in it. You chose to enter the arena, and the arena was never going to be fair because the foolish person does not know they are in an arena. They think they are just talking. You are the one burning. This is one of the most liberating realizations a person can have, because the moment you understand that your engagement is a choice, not a requirement, not an obligation, not a sign of your intelligence or moral courage, everything changes. You start to see the off-ramp. You start to feel where the drain is, and you start to learn how to step back from it before it pulls you under. But let us go deeper, because there is a layer to this that goes beyond ego and beyond energy management. There is a spiritual dimension to how wise people handle foolishness, and I use the word spiritual not in a religious sense, but in the sense of something that touches the deepest part of who you are. Wise people understand that every person they encounter, including foolish ones, perhaps especially foolish ones, is at a specific point in their own journey. That journey may be moving very slowly. It may be moving in the wrong direction entirely, at least from where you are standing. But it is their journey, and there is a certain respect, a kind of sacred respect, in allowing people to be where they are, without constantly trying to drag them somewhere they have not yet decided to go. This is not indifference. This is not coldness. In fact, it is one of the most generous things you can offer another person, the space to be exactly who they are, without the weight of your judgment and your frustration and your need to fix them, pressing down on them every moment. Wise people create this space not because they have stopped caring, but because they have understood something about caring that most people never reach. Genuine care does not demand that its object change in order to be worthy of the care. Genuine care holds the door open, lights the path, and then steps back. It does not grab the person by the arm and force them through. Now let us bring this into the practical world, because philosophy without application is just decoration. What does this actually look like on a Tuesday afternoon when your co-worker is spreading misinformation about a project you worked on for months? What does it look like when someone in your family makes a decision so spectacularly self-destructive that you can barely watch? What does it look like when you are being publicly criticized by someone whose understanding of your work is so shallow it borders on parody? The first practical tool is what we might call the pause before the response. Not the pause of someone who is struggling to find words. The deliberate, conscious, trained pause of someone who knows that the first response that rises in you, the hot, immediate, emotionally charged one, is almost never the response that serves you. Wise people have trained themselves to feel that first response, to recognize it, and to let it pass like weather before they decide how or whether to respond at all. This is not suppression. Suppression is pushing the feeling down and pretending it is not there. This is acknowledgement. Yes, this is irritating. Yes, this feels unjust. Yes, part of me wants to react, followed by a choice made from a calmer, clearer place. The pause is where wisdom lives. Everything before the pause is just reflex. The second practical tool is what we might call the question of cost. Before you engage with a foolish person or a foolish situation, before you invest your time and your words and your emotional energy, ask yourself one question. What will this cost me and what will I gain? Not what should it cost, not what is fair, not what the foolish person deserves. What will it actually cost you and what will you actually gain? In most cases, be honest, The cost is significant and the gain is nearly zero. The foolish person will not be persuaded. The situation will not be resolved. The only thing you will have at the end of it is less energy and more frustration than when you started. When you see that clearly, when you hold it in front of you without flinching, the decision to disengage becomes not a defeat but a very obvious act of self-preservation. The third tool is perhaps the most subtle and the most powerful. It is the practice of understanding without agreement. Wise people have developed the capacity to understand why a foolish person thinks what they think, to trace the logic, however broken, that led them to their conclusions without ever needing to agree with it or validate it. This matters because so much of our frustration with foolish people comes from treating their views as mysteries, as things that make no sense. But almost nothing a human being believes makes no sense from inside their own experience. Almost every foolish belief, every misguided action, every baffling decision has a trail of internal logic that, given that person's history, their fears, their wounds, their limited information, is in some twisted way coherent. When you can see that trail, when you can understand it without walking it yourself, the foolishness stops being maddening and starts being sad. And it is very hard to be destroyed by something you feel compassion for. This does not mean you excuse it. This does not mean you accept poor treatment or remain in situations that damage you. Compassionate understanding and firm personal boundaries are not opposites. In fact, the wisest people hold both of these things simultaneously and without contradiction. They can see the wound that drives the behavior and still say clearly, that behavior cannot continue in my life. They can feel genuine compassion for someone and still remove that person from their inner circle. These things can coexist, and learning to hold them both at the same time is one of the genuine marks of emotional and spiritual maturity. Let us talk about silence, because silence is one of the most misunderstood and underused tools in the entire human communication toolkit. In a culture that rewards noise, that treats loudness and certainty and the speed of your response as proxies for intelligence, silence is almost revolutionary. Wise people know that not every foolish statement requires a response. Not every provocation requires engagement. Not every argument, however wrong, however unjust, however maddening, requires your voice. And the ability to remain silent, not from weakness, not from defeat, but from a deep and grounded understanding that your silence is more powerful than your words, is something that takes years to build and is worth every moment of the building. Think about the moments in your own life when someone remained completely calm and quiet in response to something that should have provoked them. What did you feel in that moment? For most people, it is a very specific and slightly uncomfortable sensation, a sudden awareness that the person who stayed silent is operating from a different level than the person who was speaking. There is a gravity to it. There is a dignity to it that no argument, however well constructed, can quite achieve. Silence, deployed with intention and without resentment, communicates something that words never quite can. It communicates that you are not threatened. It communicates that you are not in need of winning this particular battle. And it communicates that you know something the other person does not yet know, and you are comfortable waiting for them to catch up or not. Here is something that rarely gets said in the conversation about dealing with difficult people. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is nothing at all, not as a strategy, not as a tactic, but as a genuine recognition that the universe has its own corrective mechanisms, and your job is not to be all of them. Foolish behavior tends to carry consequences. Those consequences are not always immediate. They are not always visible to you, but they exist. And the person who is committed to foolishness is not escaping those consequences by virtue of your inability to convince them otherwise. The rock still shapes the water. Gravity still works. You do not need to be the one who delivers every lesson. This is a particularly important point for people who have a strong sense of justice, people who feel deeply that wrongs should be corrected, that truth should prevail, that foolishness should be held accountable. There is something genuinely admirable in that impulse. But when it becomes the engine of every interaction, when it turns every encounter with ignorance into a moral crusade, it becomes something that harms the person who carries it far more than it harms the ignorance it is aimed at. Wise people feel that sense of justice, they honor it, and then they ask it to step aside long enough for them to act effectively rather than just righteously. Let us talk about the people closest to you, because the principles we have been discussing are challenging enough to apply with strangers or colleagues. But the real test, the one that separates intellectual understanding from genuine wisdom, is how you apply them with the people you love. Because the foolishness of people we love lands differently. It hurts differently. It pulls at us more intensely because the stakes feel higher and the history runs deeper. When someone you love is making a decision you can see will hurt them, the temptation to override the principles, to argue harder, to push more, to force the issue is almost irresistible. And yet wise people know, often from painful first-hand experience, that love does not grant you the power to think for someone else. That proximity does not equal authority over another person's mind. And that some of the most profound and lasting damage done to close relationships has come from the insistence of one person that they knew better than the other and that they were going to make sure that was understood regardless of the cost. Love, real love, the kind that endures and deepens over time, requires the same patience and the same respect for autonomy that wisdom requires in every other arena, perhaps more so. Because where love is, the ego is rarely far behind, and the ego in love is one of the most dangerous forces a human being can experience. There is a quality that all genuinely wise people seem to carry, regardless of culture, regardless of tradition, regardless of the specific path they walk to get there. That quality is what we might call unshakable inner stillness, not blankness, not disconnection. Not the artificial calm of someone who has numbed themselves to the world, a stillness that coexists with full, vivid awareness of everything happening around them, a stillness that is present in the middle of chaos, in the middle of conflict, in the middle of foolishness at its most extreme, because it does not depend on the external world being a certain way in order to exist. It comes from inside. It comes from a relationship with oneself that is so rooted, so clear, so honest that the turbulence of other people's limitations simply cannot reach the core of it. This stillness is not a personality trait you either have or you do not. It is something built. It is built in the moments when you choose the pause over the reflex. It is built in the moments when you choose understanding over argument. It is built in the moments when you choose your own peace over the satisfaction of being right. Every single one of those moments is a brick. And over time, if you are consistent, if you are honest with yourself, if you are willing to be uncomfortable for long enough, you build something inside yourself that no foolish person, no impossible situation, no unjust circumstance can knock down. That is the real prize here, not the ability to shut down a foolish argument, not the tactical skills of disengagement, but the slow, patient construction of a self that does not need the external world to be orderly in order to function at its highest level. Because here is the final truth, the one that ties everything together and that I want you to carry with you long after this video ends. The way you deal with foolishness is a mirror. It shows you in real time with complete accuracy where you are in your own development. When foolishness makes you rage, it is telling you something about your own attachment to control. When foolishness makes you collapse, it is telling you something about your own need for validation. When foolishness makes you obsess and ruminate and replay conversations at 2 a.m, it is telling you that your inner stillness still has gaps in it, not as a condemnation, but as a compass, pointing to the next place that needs your attention, pointing to the next brick that needs to be laid. Wise people are not people who never get irritated. They are not people who have transcended the human experience. They are people who have learned to read those moments of irritation as information rather than instruction. They feel it. They notice it. And then they ask, what is this showing me? What is this asking me to look at? Not in the other person, in themselves. That question, asked honestly and consistently, is the engine of a very particular kind of growth. The kind that does not depend on the world being better than it is. The kind that does not require foolish people to stop being foolish. The kind that happens inside you regardless of everything outside you, building something so solid and so real that when you move through a room, people feel it, not because you are performing it, but because it is true. The world will never run out of foolish people. There will always be someone whose cup is full. There will always be someone who mistakes noise for power and stubbornness for strength. There will always be someone who cannot see what you see, who refuses what you offer, who responds to light with anger because light reveals things they have not yet decided to look at. That will not change. What can change, what has always been available to change, is you, your response, your energy, your direction, your relationship with the inevitable, beautiful, maddening chaos of being a human being living among other human beings. The question I want to leave you with, and I mean this as something to actually sit with, not just scroll past, is this. Think of one specific person in your life right now who you have been trying to change, argue with, correct, or convince, and ask yourself honestly, what would happen if you stopped? Not from defeat, not from giving up, but from wisdom. What would open up in your life if you took all of that energy and poured it into something that could actually grow? What would you build? What would you become? I would genuinely love to know what comes up for you when you sit with that question. Write it in the comments below, because sometimes the most important conversation you can have is the one where you finally stop talking to the person who will not listen and start talking to the person who will, which is you.